Good evening, folks. This is The Weird Part, and I am your host, Vincent Treewell. This evening, I would like to discuss the life and work and impact of a real pioneer in the fields of alternative anthropology and lost history. I'm speaking of Dr. Joseph B. Mahan, PhD.
So, it was 1994, and I was in the U.S. Army, and I was in 11 Bravo Infantry, and I was stationed at Fort Benning, Georgia. And one weekend, a friend of mine and I wanted to do something other than drink, so he suggested, why don't we go to the museum? And I said, what museum are you talking about? And he said, well, in Columbus, which is immediately off the grounds of Fort Benning, there's a Civil War Naval Museum. And that sounded kind of interesting. And so we went there. Well, we get there, and the place is almost completely empty. And the professor, who is the curator of the museum, is bringing in some things from some artifacts from his car. And he's an older man. And he asks, could we help him carry in these artifacts into the museum? And yes, we could. So that was Dr. Mahan. And he was a genuinely nice guy. And he was what you might call a natural-born professor. He kind of would talk your ear off. And I mean that in a good way, because the stuff he was talking about was fascinating. And we're carrying in these artifacts, which were, as I recall, mostly stones with etchings on them or with markings on them of pictures. And I remember one in particular that was a figure with a human body and a ram's head. And I asked him, what is this stuff? And he said they come from a shrine in a cave in Illinois. And I said, shrine? Of what religion would they be a shrine of? And that's when he shows me his 32nd degree Mason's ring. And he says, Masonry, and this isn't a word-for-word quote, but it's a paraphrase. He says, Masonry is the remnants of this once worldwide religion. And it had a network of shrines all across the United States and in other parts of the world. And at that point, my mind is pretty blown. And he proceeds to give me a roughly hour explanation of his theories in alternative archaeology. And it was one of the most intense intellectual experiences I've ever had. And he proceeds to explain that many centuries before Columbus, there were a lot of other quote-unquote old world people who came to and had interactions with Native Americans. And that he has devoted his life to studying this lost history and trying to make it not lost history, but trying to bring the academic perception up to date and in line with the facts. And he was a very controversial figure. He explained that he was a founder of the Institute for the Study of American Cultures, the ISAC, which is sometimes described as a hyper-diffusionist anthropological association. It is no longer in existence, but it can be found, its website can be found in the Wayback Machine, and they have a lot of fascinating material. Completely revising the history of, well, the entire world, but particularly the Americas, and making it really clear that there was a lot of contact between Europe, Asia, Africa, and North and South America, way before Columbus, and in ways that, well, I think we'd all find very interesting. It is, frankly, somewhat difficult to separate in my mind things that Dr. Mahan told me firsthand that day and things that I later learned from reading his work and other ISAC publications. But, I mean, it was a whirlwind tour that he gave me, and I was extremely fortunate to have met him because he died the next year. And so it was a extremely fortuitous event that I was able to meet him. Dr. Mahan had earned his PhD from the University of North Carolina in 1970. His papers can be found and are still available for academic study at Columbus State University in Georgia. Dr. Mahan wrote several books, probably the most prominent of which is North American Sun Kings, Keepers of the Flame, which he wrote with Cyclone Covey, a professor from Wake Forest, in 1992. Also very interesting is 1983's The Secret, America in World History Before Columbus. He had done extensive research with the Yuchi, which is Y-U-C-H-I, tribe of indigenous people, and had concluded that there was a strong connection between that tribe and cultures in Egypt and the Middle East, and that was reflected in a lot of their spiritual beliefs and practices. Without attempting to give an encyclopedic description of Dr. Mahan's work, which would be impossible here. After all, the man was a PhD for 25 years and did extensive research before and after obtaining his doctorate, had numerous published articles and books and studies, and, was a working academic for decades. Instead, let me cover some of the concepts that were either originated by Dr. Mahan or come from the organization that he founded, the ISAC, and why I find them interesting, why I think they're worth everyone's time and effort to look into and to read up on and to just see what you find, see how it changes your worldview, because it certainly changed mine. I guess to explain why Dr. Mahan was considered a radical, I'd first have to explain very briefly the standard academic view of how Native Americans came to be here and why he differed from that. The standard academic view, especially in his time, it has changed somewhat over the subsequent years, but especially at the time where I met with Dr. Mahan and throughout his career, really, the view, the official version, was that there was a land bridge from Siberia, northern Asia, over to what is now Alaska, and that, this is all, very broad stroke approximation, but that was the official view, that there's a land bridge, that when that land bridge was dry and above water, ancient peoples walked over from Asia and just walked down from, and I say walked, did not have horses, did not have anything to ride on, that they walked from Alaska down through Canada, down through North America, through Mexico, through Central America, and all through to the bottom of South America. And that was the only way that anybody got here. And despite legends of people arriving on boats, and despite legends of previous homelands, and despite all of their own history, which tells several different scenarios for how various indigenous peoples arrived here. Now, that how they came here was over the land bridge and all the way down from Alaska. That's how they got here, period, was essentially the official view. And Dr. Mahan had found a lot of evidence that didn't match with that at all. And I guess I should elaborate. The official view also was that between the land bridge about 10 to 12,000 years ago and 1492 and the arrival of Christopher Columbus, there was virtually no other contact with Europe, Asia, Africa, anywhere else. And that also was belayed by a lot of physical evidence and a lot of evidence in the histories of indigenous peoples themselves and in artifacts and things that they had left behind. Gradually, over time, the official version has had to change just by a preponderance of the evidence that at minimum the Vikings had pre-Columbian contact with indigenous peoples in the far north, and that there was some Polynesian ancestry to some indigenous peoples in the northwest. However, most of Dr. Mahan's theories still remain rejected and alternative, not through lack of evidence or lack of scholarship, but just through the closed-mindedness of academia, which is probably not a huge shock to a lot of listeners here. But he discovered the things he discovered, and there was not any one single thread upon which everything else hangs. He had done a lot of research, had interviewed a lot of people extensively, and had multiple sources and multiple reasons for believing the things that he did. He was very much into the study of coins. He was very much into the study of etchings, engravings, words written into stone, and very much into the fairly obvious indicators that people had come here not once or twice, but on a regular basis for thousands of years. And that flies in the face of the standard version. For example, in Central America, there are statues of people that are pretty obviously of African descent. And some anthropologists have connected them to a King Juba from Africa, and explorations and perhaps even trade that he established centuries and centuries ago. Likewise, there has been writing found, etchings found, that appear to be ancient Hebrew. Also appear to be ancient Japanese in different sites. There are, once you start looking into this stuff, a lot of unexplainable things that end up all over what is now the United States, Canada, Mexico, and South and Central America. Probably the largest concept that really sticks with me and that causes me to find this type of thing interesting is just the sheer vastness of how much we don't know. How little of human history is really documented and nailed down and we're certain of. The things that we don't know vastly overwhelm what we do know. And when you start to dig even a little bit, you quickly find that a lot of history, and the further back you go, the more it is this way. A lot of history is really unclear, is speculative. Could be this, could be that, could be something else, could be something we haven't even thought of. A lot is unanswered. Much more is unanswered than is truly factually known. And I just find that pretty fascinating. Questions such as, who were the ancient Egyptians? Where did their culture come from? How were they connected to the ancient Israelites? Who was Moses? Was Moses also the Egyptian pharaoh Akhenaten? Where did the Israelites go? Were they all accounted for in the captivity in Babylon? Or were there lost tribes? And did these lost tribes end up in what is now the Americas? And that gets into some very interesting territory, and it gets there very quick. And those are some questions that Dr. Mahan took on, and those are some questions that the Institute for the Study of American Cultures took on, and sometimes found multiple possible answers. And those are topics that should be continuing subjects of actual research. And I think that, frankly, a lot of the time they get swept under the rug, they get dismissed, and there are, they're trivialized by academics who are not, I'm not saying academics are evil people at all, that's not what I mean, but they have a huge vested interest in not looking too far outside their very specialized field, and not having wild ideas, and not having speculation that can't be methodically backed up with tons of documentation and evidence, even though the further back you go, the more difficult it is to find any of that stuff. Just to be honest and transparent, I have to lay out a couple of facts and just throw in a couple of caveats. The shrine in Illinois, in a cave in Illinois, that Dr. Mahan was talking about was Burroughs Cave. And a man named Russell Burroughs said that he had found all sorts of amazing things in this cave in Illinois, and produced artifacts which have been relegated to the status of fakery by a lot of people. And now Dr. Mahan stuck by Burroughs Cave as being real, but again, he did pass away in 1995, and the ensuing 2.5 decades have not been good for the reputation of Burroughs Cave. It may have been a complete scam, it may have been a complete forgery, and it may have best been a money-making scheme for Burroughs. I am not in any way vouching for the Burroughs Cave artifacts or anything to do with that. But at the same time, Dr. Mahan's theories and work do not hang on Burroughs Cave. That, he came up with these ideas well before that, and they stand independent on their own. Also, I would just like to throw in a couple of caveats for those newly interested in this field. When you start talking about lost tribes of Israel and their arriving in the Americas, and basically ancient Israelites having a presence in the New World, then you get a lot of friends, a lot of people that are interested in this stuff real quick. And there are a number of people who are of the Mormon faith and who are looking for archaeology that will prove the Book of Mormon to be true. In and of itself, I have no problem with that at all, as long as they're willing to subject the evidence to actual rigorous scrutiny. Then, no, if that's your objective, well, good for you. I'd be fascinated to find out what you find. But just as with everything else, there are people who are willing to look at the evidence objectively, and maybe it fits, maybe it doesn't. And there are people who just have an axe to grind and will grasp at any straw to try to prove what they want to believe. And that's certainly not in any way limited to Mormons. When you get into Lost Tribes of Israel, you get into a real cornucopia of bizarre ideas, and a lot of people who want to be chosen people, and a lot of people who have sometimes very bad ideas hidden within that. And so just a caveat that there are people promoting white supremacy, some promoting black supremacy, some promoting all sorts of just bizarro ideas that aren't supported by much of anything, who are really latched on to the whole idea of lost tribes of Israel. Which is interesting because when Dr. Mahan is talking about the peoples of the Middle East being connected to the Yuchi Indians and to other Native American peoples, it's not a straight, and then the Israelites came here and they became the Yuchi Indians. That's not what he's saying. It's much more complex and nuanced than that. And any legit ISAC or otherwise alternative anthropologist would say something similar, that it's not just as clear-cut as the biblical Israelites showed up in America and end of story. That's what happened. It's far more nuanced. It's more about influences and contacts and long-term evolutions than it is about sudden appearances by biblical characters in what is now the Americas. Which brings us, of course, to the topic of horses. That seems like a jump, but it's not. It's not at all. There is a real, solid question of when horses were used by Native American peoples. Now, the official version is that even though the horse evolved in what is now the Americas, that indigenous peoples in the Americas did not have horses at the time of the arrival of the Spaniards, and did not get horses until Europeans brought them over, and some escaped or were stolen. Now, a lot of evidence says otherwise, and a lot of alternative archaeology has shown copious examples of there being pre-Columbian horses. And this, it's a big deal to those who are looking for Mormon references, because there are horses in the Book of Mormon. But there's also a lot of other people very interested in this, and I'd like to make note of one in particular. And that is the work of Dr. Yvette Running Horse Collin, PhD, who did her PhD thesis in 2017 on just this exact topic. Her dissertation is titled "The Relationship Between the Indigenous Peoples of the Americas and the Horse, Deconstructing Eurocentric Myth." And she proceeds to take apart the idea that there were no horses in the Americas until the Spaniards, and shows a lot of evidence that the indigenous peoples of the Americas had the horse from time immemorial. She did that for the University of Alaska at Fairbanks, 2017. Finally, I would like to mention the Freemasons and the statement by Dr. Mahan that Masonry is the remnants of a once worldwide religion, and him showing me his 32nd degree Mason's ring. I wish that I would have had more time and opportunity to fully discuss that with Dr. Mahan, because he didn't elaborate in great detail, other than to say that there was a network of sun kings around the world, and which included all the continents, and that all the populated continents, and that Masonry had claimed the ruins thereof. And I wish that he had elaborated more. I wish I'd asked a lot more questions. But that's pretty much what I have on that, other than if you read into speculative Masonry, and you read into the things that Masons have believed over time, they do believe themselves to be the holders of knowledge that would otherwise have been totally lost, and that is held on to from before the flood of Noah, and which is a event that is recorded in some form or another in virtually every culture in the world. And so yes, they are, at least purport to be, hope to be, try to be, holders of ancient knowledge. And that's about what I can tell you at this point. But I'd love to do a deep dive and do some research on that in the future. So in conclusion, I'd just like to say that meeting Dr. Mahan ignited in me a lifelong interest in alternative history, alternative anthropology, and in a broader sense, in questioning the accepted version, questioning what do we really know, and being more comfortable with ambiguity, not having to have an ironclad certainty. And for that, I will be forever grateful. Thank you, and good night.